Just a nurse. That's what they saw when Danielle Ross clocked in at Cedar Creek Medical at 6 in the morning, her badge still slightly damp from the humidity outside, her scrubs the exact shade of institutional blue that made everyone look equally forgettable. Just a nurse with steady hands and no pedigree, no prestigious fellowship, no last name that opened doors at medical conferences. Just a nurse who moved through the ICU corridors of the Savannah hospital like she was counting steps, measuring distances, assessing angles the way other people read newspapers. Dr. Mercer didn't notice the precision in her movements. He saw the absence of credentials instead. The ICU at Cedar Creek smells like antiseptic and something underneath it, something organic and faintly metallic, the smell of bodies fighting to stay alive under fluorescent lights that hum at a frequency that makes your teeth ache if you listen too long. Danielle had been listening to that hum for 3 weeks now, ever since she arrived under a credential level she didn't actually possess, with a nursing license that was real but incomplete, with a pass she would take to whatever came after this. The overhead intercom crackled with a page for respiratory therapy. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in room 402. Somewhere down the hall, and for pump beeped its steady warning that the line was running empty. She moved between the beds like a ghost, checking lines with hands that didn't hesitate, adjusting oxygen flow rates with the kind of muscle memory that comes from having done it under conditions far worse than this. Her right forearm bore a thin scar along the radial nerve, faint, barely visible, the kind of mark that looked accidental unless you knew what to look for. She kept it covered with long sleeves even in the Georgia heat that turned the hospital parking lot into shimmering asphalt by noon. The scar was a memory. The scar was evidence. The scar was the kind of thing that got you reassigned if anyone asked questions. Room 404 had the patient she was actually here to protect. Commander Hayes, Coast Guard medic, lay in the bed with his chest wrapped in surgical dressing and his eyes tracking her every movement with the kind of focus that comes from recognizing something your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. 3 weeks post-op from the Bagram shrapnel removal, 14 pieces of metal extracted from his chest cavity, 2 of them within millimeters of his left ventricle, all of them souvenirs from a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. His chart said he was recovering well. His chart said his sinus rhythm was stable. His chart didn't say anything about the operation that had gotten him there, the decision that had pulled Captain Danielle Ross out of theater 2 days before the IED went off, the reassignment that saved her life by trading it for his. "How's the pain?" she asked, keeping her voice pitched low, keeping it soft the way a civilian nurse would keep it soft. Deferential. Unthreatening. The kind of voice that wouldn't draw attention. 8 out of 10, Hayes said, and his eyes held hers for exactly 1 second too long. But it's getting better. She adjusted his morphine pump without breaking eye contact. You'll sleep better tonight. That wasn't a prediction. That was a promise made in code, in the language they both understood but couldn't speak out loud, not here where the hospital staff was already suspicious of her, or would be, once Dr. Mercer got involved. And he would get involved. He always did. The morning round started at 7:15, announced not by any formal process but by the sudden shift in the hospital's atmosphere, like the air pressure changing before a storm. Dr. Mercer arrived with an entourage of residents trailing behind him like ducklings, his white coat crisp and his voice already raised at a third-year resident who'd apparently made the fatal mistake of suggesting an alternative antibiotic regimen. The resident's face had gone the color of old bone. Mercer's voice cut through the ICU like a surgical blade. "That's not how we practice medicine at Cedar Creek," Mercer said, and the finality in his tone suggested this was a conversation that had been had before, many times, always with the same conclusion. "We follow evidence-based protocols. We don't experiment on patients based on what you read on some internet forum." The resident said nothing. The correct response was always silence. Danielle kept her eyes on the monitors, on the steady green lines that tracked Hayes' heart, his oxygen saturation, his blood pressure. She didn't look at Mercer. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She performed the invisible work of the ICU, the work that kept people alive and never got written up in hospital newsletters. Mercer's eyes found her anyway. They moved across her face, across her hands, across the way she stood with her shoulders slightly squared and her weight distributed evenly on both feet, the stance of someone who had learned balance through trauma rather than yoga classes. For just a moment, something flickered across his expression, not quite recognition, not quite suspicion, something in between that made her pulse jump once before settling back to normal. "You," he said, and it wasn't a question. "How long have you been at Cedar Creek?" 3 weeks, Danielle answered, keeping her voice light, keeping it empty. "I transferred from the VA in Atlanta." "And your credentials?" "RN license, active. Critical care certification through the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. I've got my ACLS, my PALS, my TNCC." It was all technically true. Technically true was the best kind of lie because it was defensible, because it held up under the kind of casual scrutiny that passed for due diligence in most hospitals. What her credentials didn't include was her captain's rank, her 12 years of combat medicine, her 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, her field experience treating blast injuries that made most of her civilian colleagues look like they were playing dress-up in their hospital whites. TNCC, Mercer repeated, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was filing that away, storing it for later examination. Trauma Nursing Core Course. Standard certification. Nothing that would alarm anyone. Nothing that would explain the precise way she'd hung the 4-line in Hayes's left antecubital fossa, threading the needle at exactly the right angle to minimize infiltration risk. "I had a patient with a spinal cord injury," she said, offering it like a gift. The trauma certification seemed relevant. Mercer nodded, but his eyes were still on her, the way a predator watches prey that hasn't quite registered the danger yet. He was the kind of man who built his identity on hierarchy, on the visible markers of accomplishment, the diplomas on the wall, the letters after his name, the way the residents jumped when he raised his voice. He was the kind of man for whom a woman with steady hands and no prestigious fellowship was either a threat to his worldview or a useful target for his contempt. Danielle had learned a long time ago how to manufacture the appearance of being the latter. "Well," Mercer said, his tone shifting into something that approximated friendliness but landed somewhere closer to condescension, "I'm sure you'll find the standards at Cedar Creek quite a bit higher than what you're used to at a VA facility. We maintain a certain level of rigor here. I trust you won't have any trouble adapting." It wasn't a statement that invited response. Danielle continued adjusting Hayes's for flow rate, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that came from having threaded lines in the dark, under fire, while rounds were impacting 30 meters away. The motion was automatic. The precision was involuntary. Muscle memory didn't require permission to exist. "I'm sure I'll manage," she said. Mercer moved on to the next patient, his residents trailing behind him, and the moment broke like tension releasing from a stretched cable. Hayes's hand reached out, caught her wrist with just enough pressure to register, then released immediately. No one had seen it. No one was looking. The hum of the fluorescent lights resumed. The ventilator wheezed. The monitors beat their steady rhythm of vital signs, of bodies holding on, of the temporary reprieve that medicine offered before biology reasserted itself. Danielle checked the bag of saline hanging from the four-stand, half empty, would need replacement in 6 hours, and moved to the next bed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer had already begun the process of assessment, the mental calculation that would eventually determine whether she was a useful addition to his ICU or a threat to his authority. The worst part was that she could feel it happening, the way a sailor feels the barometer dropping before a storm arrives. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in the next few days, he would request her personnel file, would examine her credentials with the intensity of someone looking for weaknesses, would begin building a case against her that would look perfectly reasonable to hospital administration. The worst part was that she couldn't fight back without revealing exactly why she was here, and revealing that would compromise the entire operation. Danielle had been trained to handle situations where the enemy was clear, where you could identify the threat and neutralize it with precision and force. But this was different. This was a civilian environment where the enemy wore a white coat and held institutional authority, where fighting back would only confirm his suspicions, where the only viable strategy was to appear weak enough to be dismissed while remaining strong enough to do the job she'd been sent here to do. Commander Hayes was sleeping now, the morphine pulling him under, his breathing easy for the first time in 3 weeks. His monitor showed steady sinus rhythm, heart rate 68, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation 96%. All the numbers that meant survival. All the data points that suggested he would live to see next week, next month, next year. As long as nothing went wrong. As long as nobody at Cedar Creek Medical discovered that the quiet nurse in room 404's ICU had kept the patient alive through the worst night of his recovery, had known exactly what to do when his oxygen dropped, had hands steady enough to perform an emergency needle decompression in a combat zone at 19 years old and steady enough now at 31 to do it again if she had to. As long as Danielle could hold her composure while Dr. Mercer began the slow work of dismantling her credibility. She clocked out at 2 in the afternoon and drove to the park by the river, where the Spanish moss hung from the oak trees like the grey hair of something ancient and dying slowly. She sat on a bench and stared at the water and didn't cry, because crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, because the person she had been before Bagram was a luxury she had already spent. Somewhere in her locker at Cedar Creek Medical, folded inside a book about civilian nursing practice, lay a flag that had been draped over a flag that had been folded into a triangle. The flag represented her best friend, Captain Sarah Chen, who had died on the same operation that should have killed her but didn't, because sometimes luck was just the absence of physics. She had come to Cedar Creek Medical to protect Commander Hayes. She had come to ensure that the intelligence he carried in his head didn't die in a hospital bed in Savannah. What she hadn't anticipated was that the hospital itself might kill him first. Grand rounds at Cedar Creek Medical happened at 7 in the morning, which meant coffee was still hot and guards were still down. Danielle arrived early to check Hayes's vitals, oxygen saturation steady at 94%, heart rate holding at 86, breath sounds present bilaterally. She documented everything in precise notation, the kind of detail that belonged in a combat casualty report, not a civilian hospital chart. The kind that made her hands move with muscle memory that predated nursing school by 17 years. Dr. Mercer arrived with his entourage. 12 staff members circled the bed like students at an autopsy, residents and nurses and respiratory techs waiting for instruction. He stood at the foot of the bed, Hayes still sedated from the morning medications, and held up Danielle's patient chart like it was evidence in a murder trial. This is what happens when we let undertrained staff make clinical decisions beyond their scope, Mercer said, tapping the paper with 2 fingers. His voice carried the particular resonance of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Note the detailed assessments. The proactive interventions. Admirable effort from our little Florence Nightingale here, but dangerously close to practicing medicine without a license. Danielle stood against the wall, arms crossed. Her face was carved from stone. One of the residents shifted his weight. A nurse glanced sideways, then quickly away. Mercer turned a page. Commander Hayes presents with post-operative healing consistent with standard thoracic recovery. And yet, he let the pause extend like a blade, someone seems convinced he's deteriorating. Nursing anxiety. It happens. He said her name with audible quotation marks. Nurse Ross, was it? I appreciate the initiative, truly. But let's leave the diagnostics to those of us with the training to interpret them. Danielle didn't blink. Didn't move. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless mechanical song above her head, and she counted the seconds of silence, 1, 2, 3, while Mercer returned the chart to the bedside table and moved on to the next patient, already talking about infection protocols and prophylactic antibiotics for a different case. The group moved down the hall. The moment they left, she adjusted Hayes's oxygen tubing and checked his foresight again. Everything looked fine. Everything always looked fine until it wasn't. 2 hours later, the vending machine hummed in the break room like a small industrial animal. Danielle fed it $3 bills and pressed the button for black coffee, something to do with her hands, something to occupy the 5 minutes between shift segments. The break room smelled like stale microwaved lasagna and the ghost of someone's burnt popcorn from yesterday. Mercer walked in with 2 of his surgical fellows trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark. You know what I love about nurses who think they're doctors? His voice filled the room with the easy certainty of a man who had never experienced genuine doubt. The confidence. The delusion. Playing dress-up doesn't make you qualified, sweetheart. I've been doing this for 28 years. You've been doing this for, what, 3? 4. The vending machine released her coffee. It fell with a plastic thunk into the dispenser. 8 people in the break room suddenly became very interested in their own beverages, their phones, the ceiling. The kind of silence that comes when people are actively choosing not to intervene. Mercer continued. I'm going to be honest with you, out of professional courtesy. Your file doesn't reflect the kind of rigorous training that would give you the credibility to second-guess my clinical decisions. Your references at the VA? Very sparse. Your nursing school records? Let's just say you barely scraped by academically. I've been having the board look into whether your credentials might have been embellished. The words landed like a body hitting pavement. Danielle picked up her coffee. The phone was already cooling at the edges. She turned toward him, and in that moment, something shifted in her posture. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just the subtle realignment of someone who had made a decision. She met his eyes with a stare as flat and cold as a frozen lake at midnight. When you're done performing for an audience that isn't impressed, she said, her voice dropping an octave, there's a patient in 404 whose post-op orders you wrote wrong. Again. Vancomycin at that dose will destroy his kidneys in 3 days. She turned and walked away before he could respond, her footsteps even and measured on the linoleum tile. Behind her, she heard him start to speak, then stop, then start again, the sound of someone sputtering, looking for footing that wasn't there. That night, she sat alone in her car in the Cedar Creek parking lot, the rain starting to hammer against the windshield like applause. She pulled out her phone and texted Marcus, if something happens, check the shadow box in the attic. You'll know when. The message sent into the darkness, and she waited. No response came. The next morning, security escorted her to HR before her shift even started. They were professional about it, respectful, even, which somehow made it worse. A formal written warning sat on the desk in front of Patricia Williams, the HR director, who looked genuinely uncomfortable about the whole affair. Insubordination, she read from the document. Overstepping professional boundaries. Questioning a senior physician's clinical judgment in a public setting. Patricia slid the paper across the desk. Dr. Mercer has documented this incident officially. There will be a record in your file. Danielle signed it without reading it. The pen felt heavy in her hand, a basic ballpoint, hospital-issued, the kind that had 10,000 identical copies somewhere in a supply closet. She signed the name she wasn't born with, in the life she wasn't authorized to be living, to protect a mission that had begun to feel like quicksand. I understand, she said. Patricia looked at her with something like pity. Is there anything you'd like to say? Any context that might help clarify the situation? Danielle could have said many things. She could have pulled up her military service record, 23 years of combat medical training, of holding people together on the edge of death, of making decisions in fire that would make most doctors' hands shake for a month. She could have mentioned Bagram. She could have said Hayes's name and the truth about why she was here. She could have told Patricia that the folded flag in her locker belonged to someone who had died because she wasn't there to save him, and that letting Hayes die for the sake of institutional hierarchy would be a betrayal she couldn't carry. Instead, she looked at the document and said nothing. All right, Patricia said quietly. You're still cleared to work. But there will be increased oversight. And Dr. Mercer has every right to file additional complaints if he documents further incidents. Danielle nodded and stood. The chair scraped against the linoleum with a sound like bone scraping bone. Through the glass office walls, she could see Mercer in the hallway outside, watching. Waiting. He had made calls. He had pulled her references. He had seen something in her that threatened him, and he was methodically dismantling her credibility one piece at a time, the way a chess player removes pawns before moving on to bigger threats. She walked past him without acknowledging his presence. His smile followed her down the corridor like a shadow that refused to stay behind. The day stretched out like taffy. She checked on Hayes every 2 hours, vitals holding steady, oxygen saturation maintaining at 94, breath sounds clear. Nothing had changed. Everything was about to change. She could feel it the way a person feels a storm approaching, pressure building in the atmosphere, the air itself becoming something different. That afternoon, Mercer stopped her outside Hayes's room. His voice was low, meant for her ears alone, though the threat in it was audible enough for anyone who wanted to hear it. "I'm going to make this very clear," he said. "Your services here are under review. If you continue to interfere with my treatment protocols, I will have no choice but to recommend immediate termination. I don't care who you know or what credentials you're claiming. This hospital has a reputation to protect, and you're a liability." Danielle kept her hands at her sides. Kept her breathing steady. "Yes, doctor." "Good." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, I'm requesting a formal credentialing review. Just a precaution. Routine procedure. These things take time, but they're very thorough." He walked away, and she went back into Hayes's room. He was awake now, eyes still slightly glazed from medication but conscious. His gaze tracked her across the room, and when she adjusted his full line, his hand found her wrist with surprising strength. "You remind me of someone," he whispered. "My old CO Nomad 6. Saved my whole team at Sanjin. Saved my life 3 times." His eyes closed. "You move like her. Fast. Precise. Like you've done this 1,000 times before." Danielle said nothing. She just adjusted his blanket and checked his oxygen tubing again, 93%. Down 1 point. Probably nothing. Probably normal post-operative drift. Probably. That night at 3 in the morning, sitting alone in the break room with a cup of coffee going cold on the table in front of her, she finally let her hands shake. Just for a moment. Just long enough to feel the tremor travel through her wrists and settle somewhere deep in her chest. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of 17 years of military training forcing her to sit still while someone else played chess with a patient's life. She texted Marcus again, the shadow box. "Soon. Be ready." At 6 o'clock in the morning, before the shift change, before Mercer arrived for rounds, Commander Hayes's monitor alarm screamed. The monitor alarm screamed at 6 in the morning, before shift change, before Mercer arrived for rounds. Danielle was 2 corridors away, restocking the supply cart with fresh syringes and alcohol swabs, when she heard it, that particular shriek that meant somebody's numbers were falling in real time. She moved before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory taking over the way it always did when the stakes shifted. Commander Hayes's room was still dim, the pre-dawn light barely touching the edges of the window blinds. His chest heaved wrong. She saw it immediately, the left side rising higher than the right, the asymmetry that meant pressure building inside the pleural cavity, air trapped where it shouldn't be. His trachea had drifted to the right like a compass needle pulled by something invisible. The oxygen saturation on the monitor read 94, dropping as she watched. 94, 92. 90. Hayes. She gripped his shoulder, steady, not frantic. "Still with me?" His eyes were open but unfocused, the white showing at the edges. His lips had started to pale at the margins. His respiratory rate was climbing, too fast, too shallow, the kind of rapid breathing that meant his body was already in crisis, already fighting for air that wasn't reaching his lungs. She grabbed the call button. Code blue, ICU bed 404. Tension pneumothorax. Get a crash cart. Get a doctor. Now. The operator's voice came back clipped and professional. The hospital swung into motion like a massive organism responding to a predator in its bloodstream. Danielle pulled Hayes's gown aside, palpating his ribs, her fingers reading the anatomy beneath the skin the way some people read text. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She knew exactly where the needle would go. But first, she had to wait. Protocol demanded she wait, that she alert the attending, that she let the system work itself. The system. The same system that had dismissed her concerns for 48 hours while Hayes deteriorated in front of Dr. Mercer's dismissive stare. This morning, before the alarm went off, she'd reported Hayes's vitals again. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 88 during the night shift. His respiratory rate was 32. His heart rate had climbed to 112. These weren't post-surgical normal. These were a body screaming, and the person responsible for listening had told her to stop being anxious about nothing. "He's fine," Mercer had said without looking up from his coffee. "Post-op respiratory changes are expected. His chest film from yesterday shows no complications." She'd tried again 2 hours later. His SAT's dropping further. 85 now. Respirations at 34. "Nurse Ross, I will not have my clinical judgment questioned by someone who can't even keep her credentials straight." He'd straightened his tie, a gesture she'd learned meant the conversation was over in his mind, even if the patient was suffocating. "The imaging is clear. Trust the data." But the data she had was different. The data she had came from her hands on his chest, from the ventilator settings, from the monitor trending his numbers downward like a graph plotting something slow death. She'd learned to read deterioration the way some people read faces, in the set of the jaw, the flare of the nostrils, the subtle shift from stable to crisis that happened in hours, not days. The crash cart burst through the door at 6:04 a.m., pushed by a resident named Dr. Patel, a careful man with steady hands who'd made the mistake once of asking Danielle's opinion in front of Mercer. He'd learned to stop asking questions after that. "Vitals?" he asked, eyes on Hayes. Oxygen sat 88 and falling. Asymmetrical chest rise. Tracheal deviation to the right. Her voice carried the precision of someone reporting data, not concern. The mask stayed in place. Tension pneumothorax. Needs imaging to confirm before intervention. Dr. Patel looked at the monitor. Looked at Hayes. Looked back at the monitor like it might contradict what his eyes were telling him. "I need imaging before I intervene," he said carefully. "Chest X-ray." "Stat." Danielle didn't argue. She'd learned not to. Instead, she watched Hayes's saturation drop to 84 and thought about a Marine medic named Rodriguez who'd bled out in a phi base outside Jalalabad because someone wanted imaging first. By the time the images came back, Rodriguez was already dead. Dr. Chen arrived next, a surgeon from the affiliated practice who consulted on thoracic cases. He took one look at Hayes, then one look at the corridor behind him, then back toward the door. "Not my patient, not my service," he said quietly. "You need the attending. Get Mercer." The door closed behind him before Danielle could respond. Oxygen saturation 81. The hiss of Hayes's labored breathing filled the room like a metronome counting down. Dr. Okonkwo came because the code alert went hospital-wide, a cardiologist who'd never treated a pneumothorax in her life. She pulled up Hayes's chart on the computer in the corner, her fingers hovering over the mouse pad. "We should wait for Mercer," she said without turning around. "He's the attending. He'll want to make the call." Danielle's hands were steady, but something in her chest had begun to tighten, not fear, never fear, but the particular tension of a warrior watching her weapon get tied behind her back. "His saturation is 79. He needs intervention now." "Mercer," Okonkwo repeated, as if saying the name would make the doctor materialize. As if saying the name would matter more than the fact that the patient was turning blue. Dr. Rashid arrived moments later, pulling up the chart again on a second computer, reviewing the imaging, reviewing the labs, reviewing everything except the man in the bed whose chest wasn't rising properly. "We could have an allergic reaction to post-surgical material," he said, more to himself than to anyone in the room. "Liability issues if we intervene without proper documentation." Liability. Danielle had learned that word well over the past 72 hours. It was the new word for cowardice, the clinical term for someone choosing their career over their patient. The hiss of the ventilator seemed to mock them all. Dr. Nguyen was the last, a pulmonologist who should have known better, who started to reach for the crash cart, his hand moving toward the equipment with something that looked like intention. His eyes met Danielle's for just a second. She saw it there, the knowledge, the understanding that something was wrong and needed fixing. Then the door opened. Dr. Mercer filled the frame the way certain people filled spaces just by existing in them, his presence a kind of gravitational distortion that made the air pressure change. He took in the scene, the 5 other doctors arranged around the room like an audience, Hayes gasping, the monitors screaming their warnings, and Danielle standing beside the crash cart with her hands on the edge of it. His eyes narrowed. Then he stepped closer to the monitor, staring at it as if it might give him instructions, might whisper what he was supposed to do next. His mouth was slightly open. His jaw was working, but no sound came out. For a man who'd filled the past 3 days with noise, uncertainty and cruelty, the silence that came from him now was louder than anything he'd said to her at the vending machine. She counted in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 doctors in the room. 5 refusals to act. 5 men and women choosing not to move while the monitor reflected the simple mathematical fact that Commander Hayes was running out of air. "This is tension pneumothorax," Danielle said. Her voice came out measured, clinical, the voice of someone stating facts that everyone could verify if they bothered to look. "If nobody else will act, I will." Mercer's head snapped toward her. His face flushed crimson, the color rising from his neck like tide water. "You are not authorized." But she was already moving, her hand closing around the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, her muscle memory overriding every protocol he'd ever constructed. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The angle precise, the pressure controlled, the kind of movement that came from having done this before, from having done this when the stakes were measured in seconds and the alternative was watching someone die. The needle pierced skin and then deeper, through the fascia, and then came the moment that defined everything, the hiss. The sharp, perfect hiss of air escaping from a space where it had no business being. The sound of pressure releasing. The sound of rescue. Hayes's saturation climbed. 78, 82, 87, 91. His chest evened out. The asymmetry resolved. The trachea drifted back toward center like a compass finding north again. "You just assaulted a patient," Mercer's voice cracked with something between rage and shock, the particular tone of a man watching his authority dissolve in real time. "Security. I need security in here now." Danielle didn't move. She didn't flinch. She kept her hand steady on the needle, her eyes on Hayes's monitor, on the oxygen saturation now climbing steadily toward normal ranges. The 5 doctors had backed away, and in their absence, something was becoming very clear. They'd looked to him because he had institutional power, not because he had any actual authority in this moment. The door burst open again. But it wasn't security. It was the night shift charge nurse, running hard, taking in the scene in a single glance and understanding exactly what had just happened. Behind her, the morning residents were starting to arrive, and word was spreading through the hospital the way crucial information always did, quickly, quietly, and with the certainty of people who knew what they'd witnessed. Mercer was still shouting something about protocols and credentials when Danielle finally looked at him. Her eyes were the color of winter, and her voice, when she spoke, carried an octave of authority that made several people in the room take an involuntary step back. His breathing tube stays. Not a suggestion. A statement. His pressures need continuous monitoring for the next 4 hours. And if you try to move him before I clear it, I'll file a restraining order myself. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. But it was the kind of silence that doesn't last, the kind that precedes a storm. And Mercer's face, flushed and working, told everyone in that room that the performance was far from over. The needle went in. Smooth. Practiced. The hiss of air escaping from Commander Hayes's chest cavity, that terrible pneumothorax that 5 doctors had decided to imaging committee into a corpse, released in a single violent breath. Danielle's hands moved on their own, the muscle memory of 100 forward surgical teams and 3 combat deployments overriding every civilian protocol Cedar Creek Medical had ever written. The needle was a 14-gauge angiocath, the kind you grab when there's no time for debates. She'd inserted it at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where anatomy and desperation intersected. The monitor climbed. O2 sat at 76. Then 79. Then 82. Hayes's color shifted from ash gray toward something that resembled a man still clinging to the breathing world. 88. 91. His chest rose symmetrically again. The trachea, which had been deviating like a compass needle toward death, realigned itself toward living. Danielle pulled her hand back. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, and for exactly 3 seconds, the entire unit went silent, the kind of silence that happens when something impossible just became real. Then Dr. Mercer made a sound that was not a word. It was a roar, the sound of someone watching his authority evaporate like sweat under halogen lights. He was pointing, his hand shaking. His voice came next, raw and amplified by rage and the humiliation that was already crystallizing in his mind. You assaulted that patient. You violated protocol. You performed an invasive procedure without authorization. That's criminal. That's malpractice. The nurses around the code cart took a collective step backward. Nobody moved to cover Commander Hayes. Nobody reached for the medication log. Everyone was watching Dr. Mercer come apart like a man whose entire sense of control had just been severed by a woman in scrubs who'd never asked permission. Danielle said nothing. She disposed of the needle in the red sharps container. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She'd done this exact procedure under small arms fire in Helm and Province while Marines laid down suppressive fire outside a forward operating base. She'd done it in a dust storm that felt like being inside a sandblaster. She'd done it when the casualty was her commanding officer and there were exactly 4 minutes before he became a name on a memorial wall. This was easier. Quieter. But Mercer was still screaming, and she understood the exact moment his fury shifted from rage into calculation. She saw it happen across his face like a door closing. He wasn't going to try to break her in the moment. He was going to burn her systematically. Within 40 minutes, Mercer was in his office with the door closed but not quite, his voice carrying through the frame like a transmitted threat. Danielle stood in the hallway with security, badge still around her neck, but she could hear every word. I want her credentials verified. Every reference checked. Contact the nursing school at the University of Virginia, verify her coursework. Pull her employment records from the VA in Washington, D.C. Check if she's ever had a single complaint, a single incident. Mercer's tone was clinical now, weaponized bureaucracy instead of rage. Much more dangerous. She performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. That's assault. That's malpractice. That opens the hospital to liability. There was a pause. A board member's voice on speakerphone, cautious. Mercer continued, I'm documenting everything. I want a formal investigation, and I want her badge pulled before the end of this shift. Security was a man named Thompson, someone Danielle had seen twice in 3 weeks, a square-shouldered ex-cop who didn't look at her as they walked. The VA reference she'd been given was fabricated, solid cover built by a Pentagon contractor who'd spent 6 months establishing her nursing school records, her clinical rotations, her reference letters. But Mercer was methodical. Mercer had the institutional weight. Mercer had board members who took his calls at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 8 a.m., he was requesting transcripts from the University of Virginia. By 9 a.m., the VA was getting called. By 10 a.m., someone in her cover story was telling the truth, that Danielle Ross had never worked there, that her records were clean only because they'd been constructed by people who knew how to construct them. By 2 p.m., her badge access was deactivated. The magnetic stripe still hung around her neck, a talisman that no longer worked. By 4 p.m., Thompson was walking her toward the employee exit, past the supply room where she'd assembled crash carts, past the break room where she'd eaten exactly 3 meals in 6 weeks, past the ICU where Hayes was still breathing because she'd violated every protocol Dr. Mercer had written. The nurses wouldn't meet her eyes. By 6 p.m., Danielle's apartment was a place to sit alone. By 8 p.m., she'd showered the hospital smell off her skin, that combination of antiseptic and adrenaline that clung to everyone who worked in emergency medicine. By 10 p.m., she was driving. By midnight, she was at the Starlight Diner on Victory Drive, a place that was always open because truckers didn't sleep and neither did people who'd been running for 17 years. The vinyl booth cracked slightly when she sat down. Her coffee came in a ceramic mug that had been poured from a pot that had been sitting on a warmer since the morning shift change. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like something being slowly electrocuted. Outside, rain was falling on Savannah with the kind of weight that made the city smaller, that made the world contract into this diner and this booth and this cold coffee and the woman on the other side of the window who looked like her reflection but felt like a stranger. Danielle stared at her hands. Surgeon's hands. Hands that had held femoral arteries closed while another medic ran blood. Hands that had stabilized spines in rubble. Hands that had performed field tracheostomies under fire with a scalpel and a ballpoint pen and nothing else. Those hands had just been labeled criminal. Assaultive. Dangerous. The problem was that Mercer was correct about one thing: she wasn't a nurse. She was a captain in the Coast Guard Medical Corps, and she'd been placed at Cedar Creek Medical under deep cover to monitor Commander Hayes, a Coast Guard medic who'd come home from Bagram with shrapnel embedded in his chest and classified information embedded in his skull about an operation that had gone wrong in ways the Pentagon was still investigating. Her job was to keep him alive. Her job was to protect him. Her job was to stay invisible while she did both. She couldn't blow her cover to defend herself. She couldn't explain that she'd performed needle decompression on combat casualties because her whole branch of service depended on her staying buried under a civilian identity. She couldn't explain that 5 doctors refusing to act, Patel, Chen, Okonkwo, Rashid, and Nguyen, had made her the only person in that room with authority, with training, with the spine to move while they hid behind protocol. Danielle's locker at Cedar Creek had 3 things in it: her civilian shoes, her keys, and a folded flag. Not the American flag, though she had one at home from her last promotion. This was a Marine Corps flag, the colors muted by 16 years of being folded the same way, creases sharp enough to cut. It had been presented to her inside a gilded triangle at a ceremony in Arlington, and then it had been presented to her again, this time as a gift, not a ritual, by a lieutenant colonel who'd known the Marine it had covered. His name had been Corporal Marcus Chen, no relation to the doctor who'd abandoned Hayes during the code. Chen had been her first lieutenant back when Danielle was a petty officer learning combat medicine in the 160th SAW, before she'd made captain, before she'd led teams instead of following them. He died in Kandahar because Danielle had been pulled from their deployment for this assignment, for Cedar Creek, for Hayes. The flag in her locker was supposed to mean something about honor and sacrifice and the understood agreement that sometimes you trade one life for another and hope the math works out. The math didn't work if Hayes died because she was sitting in a diner at 3 a.m. instead of in his room where she could protect him. Danielle's phone buzzed. The screen illuminated her face, harsh, exhausted, older than it should have been. A text from a number that wasn't in her contacts, a number she recognized because her son used it when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Marcus was 17. He was smart in the way that children of intelligence officers are smart, observant, interconnected, good at piecing things together that adults left lying around. He'd found the shadow box in the attic. He'd found the deployment photos. He'd probably found the classified briefing binder she'd been reading at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. The text read, "Mom, I know what you did. I know what you are. I'm fixing this." Danielle stared at those 9 words while the rain hammered the diner window like someone trying to get in. She understood what fixing meant. She understood what he'd have to do. And she understood that he'd already decided it was necessary, the way soldiers decide things are necessary. He'd inherited that from her. She set the phone on the table. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it anyway. The next morning would arrive whether she was ready or not. Hayes would be in ICU room for 04 without her protecting him. Mercer would be calling people she'd never met, pulling threads on a cover story that had taken months to build. And somewhere in this city, her 17-year-old son was about to do something that would either save her mission or end it. Either way, the woman sitting in this vinyl booth at 3 a.m. was running out of time. Marcus walked into the hospital administrator's office at 8:36 a.m. on a Tuesday, unannounced, carrying a shadow box wrapped in brown paper like he was delivering a bomb. He set it on the mahogany table in front of the board without asking permission, his 17-year-old shoulders squared like he'd practiced this moment in the mirror. Administrator Walsh looked up from her coffee. 3 board members turned in their chairs. The paper crinkled as Marcus unwrapped it, and nobody spoke because they all understood, somehow, that something irreversible was about to happen. The shadow box fell open. Medals caught the light like bullets. Bronze star. Silence. Purple heart with oak leaf cluster. Longer silence. A second purple heart. The room wasn't breathing anymore. And underneath them, in a glass case of its own, a navy cross mounted on white silk, the weight of it visible even from across the table. Marcus had never been military, but his hands were steady as his mother's. "She served," he said, his voice too calm for a kid. 3 tours. 2 purple hearts. Navy Cross. And you fired her for saving a life. Commander Hayes was waiting in a wheelchair outside the conference room. He'd been awake for 6 days now, his chest wrapped tight but functional, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 94% on room air. When Marcus wheeled him past the glass windows, Hayes saw the shadow box through the doorway and his voice came out like gravel. "Nomad 6. He said it like a prayer. Like someone calling out across a desert. His hands trembled on the armrests, the first time she'd ever seen him lose his composure. "You're Nomad 6. You came back for me." Before Danielle could answer, a Marine liaison in dress blue stepped through the administrative door, carrying a folder that looked classified by the way he held it. He was young, maybe 28, with the bearing of someone who'd been briefed on something that changed how he saw the world. He opened the folder without sitting down, and his voice was formal as an oath. "Captain Danielle Ross," he began, reading from a citation typed in the language of military bureaucracy. "For exceptional valor under fire at Bagram airfield, personally treating 14 casualties under sustained enemy contact, maintaining medical operations when command structure had been compromised, demonstrating extraordinary leadership and disregard for personal safety, and providing life-saving intervention that prevented an estimated 8 additional casualties." He looked up from the paper. "The full citation continues, but that's the summary, Captain. The Pentagon wanted you to have a copy." "Sir." Dr. Mercer burst through the side door like something was on fire. His face had gone the color of old meat. "This is procedure violation on multiple fronts," he was saying, his voice climbing higher with each word. "We have credentialing requirements, board certifications, accreditation standards that exist for patient safety. You can't just walk into a hospital with," he saw the Navy Cross. He stopped talking. But only for a second. "This doesn't change what happened in the ICU," he continued, but now he was talking to the room instead of to anyone specific, his argument scattering like water. "Protocol exists for a reason. You can't just perform procedures without," his hands were moving, gesturing at air that wouldn't cooperate. "The investigation I initiated was appropriate given the circumstances." The doors opened. A 2-star general in dress uniform walked through them like he'd been waiting outside for a queue. His insignia caught the fluorescent light, not hospital light anymore, but something colder, official, the kind of institutional weight that made corporate hierarchy look like a child's game. He was tall in a way that made the room shrink, and when he moved, every board member leaned back like the oxygen was being pulled toward him instead of distributed equally. He didn't look at the shadow box. He looked at Danielle. His salute was crisp enough to hear, a fist striking his chest in the ancient language of respect that transcends rank and protocol. "Captain Ross," he said, and his voice was the deep rumble of someone who'd given orders that got people killed and decorated. "Your mission parameters have been updated. The Pentagon sends its regards and confirms Operation Guardian Wave is now declassified. Your service record is being integrated into your civilian file immediately. The cover you maintained will be reflected in all future documentation. Your sacrifice to this operation will be noted." He paused. Didn't blink. Dismissed to new assignment, Captain. Bethesda is expecting you in 3 weeks. He turned and walked out the same way he'd walked in, like the room was something he'd already moved through. Mercer tried to follow him. Security blocked the doorway, and that's when everything became mathematical. The investigation he'd weaponized turned into a scalpel nobody expected him to fall on. Within 72 hours, an external audit team descended on Cedar Creek like investigators on a crime scene. The tissue started to tear, surgical complication reports with Mercer's signature that had never been filed, patient deaths moved between departments like they were inventory, pharmaceutical rep payments disguised as consulting fees with dollar amounts that made someone in the Georgia Medical Board make a phone call to someone else. $300,000 in kickbacks from medical device companies. Payments traced back 7 years. Dr. Patel, the surgeon who'd frozen during Hayes' crisis, walked into the board office and gave a statement that took 90 minutes. He pressured us, Patel said. His hands shook less than they had in the ICU. He made it clear that deferring to his judgment wasn't a suggestion. It was institutional policy. Dr. Chen provided records, post-op notes altered after the fact, complications changed to protocol adjustments, a pattern so systematic that no one could claim it was accident. The Georgia Medical Board suspended his license pending criminal investigation. Malpractice insurance dropped him like he was contagious. Cedar Creek terminated his contract at an emergency board meeting that lasted 40 minutes. The hospital system blacklisted him across 3 states, which meant no credentialing, no privileges, no legitimate place to practice medicine in any institution that cared about their accreditation. Danielle watched from Hayes' room as Mercer left Cedar Creek Medical for the last time, carrying a cardboard box that held the things from his office, a photo of a house, some books, a fountain pen. Photographers from the Savannah Morning News waited outside the emergency entrance like they'd been told when he'd leave. The picture would run in the paper with a caption about board investigation and credential suspension, and his own words about dangerous overreach would come back to haunt him every single time someone did a Google search on his name. Hayes sat in his wheelchair, his chest still bound but his breathing smooth now, his color the first time matching something close to healthy human. He tried to destroy you for saving my life, Hayes said. His voice had texture now, gravel and smoke and something like peace. Danielle adjusted his full line, the drip steady and clear. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for years in places where mistakes meant body bags. He destroyed himself, she said. I just gave him enough rope. It wasn't a joke exactly, but something in it landed, the kind of observation that military people understand because they've seen it before, the way powerful systems collapse under their own weight when someone lifts the corner of the fabric and lets the light in. Marcus sat in the corner, seeing his mother clearly for the first time. Not the nurse in scrubs. Not the woman who'd raised him in apartments that rented by the month. Not the person who'd taught him not to ask questions about the photographs in the locked drawer or the conversations cut short when he entered the room. He saw Captain Danielle Ross. How long were you going to keep this secret? Marcus asked. She met his eyes. Met them directly, the way she'd never done in public, the way officers do when they're about to give you the truth you need instead of the one you want. As long as the mission required, she said. Some wars don't end when you come home. They just move locations. 6 months later, Danielle stood in the Cedar Creek ICU wearing her Coast Guard dress whites, the fabric pressed into geometric precision, her rank insignia catching light like an answer. The folded flag from her fallen teammate, the one that had sat in her locker while she worked bedpans and vital signs, was finally being laid to rest at Arlington with full honors, a ceremony she could attend now without secrecy, without cover stories, without pretending she didn't know why her hand shook when she held it. Commander Hayes stood from his wheelchair, his chest still tender but functional, his movements deliberate and strong. He rendered a salute that made 3 nurses stop moving. She returned it. The gesture was small and complete. Administrator Walsh offered her the position of Director of Emergency Medicine, a title that would have meant authority and salary and the kind of institutional respect that came with credentials nobody could question. Danielle declined, her voice steady but final. Her orders were transferring her to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the next mission was waiting, where the next set of secrets was already classified, where there would be other commands to follow and other covers to maintain and other lives depending on her capacity to move through the world unseen until the moment she needed to be visible. Through the ICU window, Marcus pointed to the community college across the street. Dr. Mercer was in room 106, teaching CPR to bored students, demonstrating chest compressions on plastic mannequins that didn't react to his touch, that didn't care about his credentials or his history or his name. $13 an hour. A former king, now invisible, exactly as he'd once made others feel. Hayes handed her a new shadow box before she left, a medal for saving his life under fire, domestic fire, the kind that took place in hospitals instead of deserts but left the same kind of scars. You broke cover for me, he said. You sacrificed the mission. She shook her head. The mission was keeping you alive, she said. Mission accomplished, Commander. They walked out together past the ICU nurses who now saluted her as she passed, not as just a nurse but as captain, as someone who'd held the line when 5 doctors abandoned the post. Administrator Walsh stood in the doorway as they left, and she said something to the remaining board members, something that would eventually become policy, something that would change how hospitals looked at their nurses, something that recognized what Danielle had always known, that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. She drove away from Savannah with Marcus in a passenger seat, the folded flag finally at peace, her cover blown but her honor intact, heading toward the next war that only she could fight. The city disappeared in the rearview mirror, and Cedar Creek Medical became a place she'd been instead of a place she belonged. If you've ever watched someone prove that the quiet person in the room might be the strongest one, if you've ever seen someone move through the world invisible until the moment they saved it, subscribe now. Like this video. Comment below with the question that's been sitting in your head since the salute. What would you have done if the Pentagon called your workplace tonight? What would you sacrifice for the mission? The answer might define you.